Chapter 2. But nothing turns out, in fact, as you have pictured it. The inn was a case in point. And so, alas, was Great Aunt Sophie's house. Neither of these to Kate were at all as they should be. An inn, of course, was a place you came to at night, not at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, preferably a rainy night. Wind, too, if it could be managed, and it should, of course, be situated on a moor. Bleak, Kate knew was the adjective here. And there should be scullions. Mine host should be gravy-stained and broad in the beam, with a tousled apron pulled across his stomach. And there should be a tall, dark stranger, the one who speaks to nobody, warming thin hands before the fire. And the fire should be a fire, crackling and blazing, laid with an impossible-sized log and roaring its great heart out up the chimney. And there should be some sort of cauldron, Kate felt, somewhere about, and a couple of mastiffs, perhaps, thrown in for good measure. But here were none of those things. There was a quiet-voiced young woman in a white blouse who signed them in at the desk. There was a waitress called Maureen, blonde, and one called Margaret, mousy with pebble glasses, and an elderly waiter, the black part of whose hair did not at all match the front. The fire was not made out of logs, but out of bored-looking coals tirelessly licked by an abject electric flicker. And worst of all, standing in front of it, instead of a tall, dark stranger, was Mr. Begwid, the lawyer. Plump, pink, but curiously cool-looking, with his silvery hair and steel-grey eye. But outside, Kate saw the bright spring sunshine, and she liked her bedroom with its view over the marketplace, its tall mahogany wardrobe, and its constant H&C. And she knew that tomorrow they would see the house, this legendary, mysterious house, which now, so surprisingly, had become real, built no longer by airy fancy, but, she gathered, of solid bricks and mortar, standing firmly in its own grounds, not 2 miles along the road. Close enough, Kate realised, if only Mrs. May would not talk so much with Mr. Begwid, for them to have walked there after tea. But when next morning they did walk there, Mrs. May in her long, slightly deerstalker-looking coat, and with her rubber-tipped walking stick made of cherry wood, Kate was disappointed. The house looked nothing at all like she had imagined. A barrack of red brick it appeared to her, with rows of shining windows staring blankly through her, as though they were blind. "They've taken the creeper down," said Mrs. May. She too sounded a little surprised. But after a moment, as they stood there at the head of the drive, she rallied slightly and added on a brisker note, "And quite right too, there's nothing like creeper for damaging brickwork." And as they began to walk on down the driveway, she went on to explain to Kate that this house had always been considered a particularly pure example of early Georgian architecture. "Was it really here?" Kate kept asking in an incredulous voice, as though Mrs. May might have forgotten. "Of course, dear, don't be so silly. This is where the apple tree was, the russet apple by the gate. And the third window on the left, the one with the bars across, that used to be my bedroom the last few times I slept here. The night nursery, of course, looks out over the back, and there's the kitchen garden. We used to jump off that wall, my brother and I, and onto the compost heap. 10 feet high it's supposed to be. I remember one day Crampfell scolding us and measuring it with his besom." Crampfell, so there had been such a person. The front door stood open, as it must have stood, Kate realised suddenly, years ago on that never-to-be-forgotten day for Ariette when she first saw the great outdoors. And the early spring sunshine poured across the newly whitened step to the high, dark hall beyond. It made a curtain of light through which it was hard to see. Beside the step, Kate noticed, was an iron shoe scraper. Was this the one down which Ariette had climbed? Her heart began to beat a little faster. "Where's the grating?" she whispered, as Mrs. May pulled the bell. They heard it jangle far off in the dim distance, miles away it seemed. "The grating," said Mrs. May, stepping backwards on the gravel path and looking along the house front. There, she said with a slight nod, keeping her voice low. It's been repaired, she whispered, but it's the same one. Kate wandered towards it. Yes, there it was, the actual grating through which they had escaped. Pod, Homily and little Arietti. There was the greenish stain and a few bricks which looked newer than the others. It stood higher than she had imagined. They must have had a bit of a jump to get down. Going up to it, she stooped, trying to see inside. Dank darkness, that was all. So this had been their home. Kate, called Mrs. May softly from beside the doorstep, as Pod must have called that day to Arietti when she ran off down the path. And Kate, turning, saw suddenly a sight she recognised, something which at last was like she imagined it. The primrose bank. Tender, blue-green blades among the faded winter grasses. Sown, spattered, almost drenched they seemed with palest gold. And the azalea bush, Kate saw, had become a tree. After a moment, Mrs. May called again, and Kate came back to the front door. We'd better ring again, she said, and once more they heard the ghostly jangle. It rings near the kitchen, Mrs. May explained, in a whisper, just beyond the green baize door. The green baize door. She seemed, Kate thought, to speak these words in capitals. At last they saw a figure through the sunbeams. It was a slatternly girl in a wet sackcloth apron, her bare feet in run-down sandals. Yes, she said, staring at them and frowning against the sun. Mrs. May stiffened. I wonder, she said, if I could see the owner of the house. You mean Mrs. Dorset Poole, said the girl, or the headmaster? She raised her forearm, shading her eyes, a wet floorcloth, dripping slightly, clasped in her grimy hand. Oh, exclaimed Mrs. May, is it a school? Kate caught her breath. That then explained the barracky appearance. Well, it always has been, hasn't it? Said the girl. No, replied Mrs. May, not always. When I was a child, I used to stay here. Perhaps then I might speak to whoever is in charge. There's only my mum, said the girl. She's the caretaker. They're all away over Easter, the masters and that. Well, in that case, began Mrs. May uncertainly, I mustn't trouble you, and was preparing to turn away when Kate, standing her ground, addressed the girl. Can't we just see inside the hall? Out yourself, said the girl, looking mildly surprised, and she retreated slightly into the shadows as though to make way. It's okay by me. They stepped through the veil of sunlight into a dimmer coolness. Kate looked about her. It was wide and high and panelled, and there were the stairs going up and up, world upon world, as Arietti had described them. All the same, it was nothing like she had imagined it. The floor was covered with burnished dark green linoleum. There was a sourish smell of soapy water and the clean smell of wax. There's a beautiful stone floor under this, said Mrs. May, tapping the linoleum with her rubber-tipped walking stick. The girl stared at them curiously. And then, as though bored, she turned away and disappeared into the shadowy passage beyond the staircase, scuffling a little in her downtrodden shoes. Kate, about to comment, felt a touch on her arm. Listen, hissed Mrs. May sharply, and Kate, holding her breath to complete the silence, heard a curious sound. A cross between a sigh and a moan. Mrs. May nodded. That's it, she whispered. The sound of the green baize door. And where was the clock? Asked Kate. Mrs. May indicated a piece of wall now studded with a row of coat pegs. There. Pod's hole must have been just behind where that radiator is now. A radiator, they'd have liked that. She pointed to a door across the hall, now labelled in neat white lettering, Headmaster's Study, and that was the morning room, she said, where the overmantels lived, and Pod got the blotting paper. Kate stared a moment, and then, before Mrs. May could stop her, ran across and tried the handle. No, Kate, you mustn't. Come back. It's locked, said Kate, turning back. Could we just peep upstairs?" she went on. "I'd love to see the night nursery. I could go terribly quietly." "No, Kate. Come along. We must go now. We've no business to be here at all." And Mrs. May walked firmly towards the door. "Couldn't I just peep in the kitchen window?" begged Kate at last, when they stood once again in the sunshine. "No, Kate," said Mrs. May. "Just to see where they lived. Where that hole was under the stove, which Pod used as a chute. Please." "Quickly then," said Mrs. May. She threw a nervous glance in each direction as Kate sped off down the path. This, too, was a disappointment. Kate knew where the kitchen was because of the grating, and making blinkers of her cupped hands against the reflected sunshine, she pushed her face close up against the glass. Dimly the room came into view, but it was nothing like a kitchen. Shelves of bottles, gleaming retorts, heavy bench-like tables, rows of Bunsen burners. The kitchen was now a lab. And that was that. On the way home, Kate picked a very small bunch of dog violets. There was veal and ham pie for luncheon, with salad, with a choice of plums and junket or baked jam roll. And after luncheon, Mr. Bigwid arrived with a car and a chauffeur to take them to see the cottage. At first, Kate didn't want to go. She had a secret plan of walking up to the field called Parkin's Beck and mooching about by herself looking for a badger's set. But when Mrs. May explained to her that the field was just behind the cottage, and by the time Mr. Bigwid had stared long enough and pointedly enough out of the window with a bored, dry, "if this were my child" kind of expression on his face, Kate decided to go in the car after all, just to spite him. And it was a good thing, as she so often told her own children years afterwards that she did. Otherwise, she might never have talked to, or, which was more important, made friends with Thomas Goodenough.